You are listening to episode 206 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Andrew Holecek joins us to speak about contemplative practice in the digital age. As meditators, we often see our mobile devices and technological advances as distractions, and certainly they can be. They're designed, after all, to not just serve a function, but to keep the attention of the customer. What are some ways in which we can live in our increasingly digital environment without always simply resorting to turning off? Andrew Holecek is a longtime student of Buddhism and frequently presents this tradition from a contemporary perspective, blending the ancient wisdom of the East with a modern knowledge from the West. Andrew has completed the traditional 3-year Buddhist meditation retreat and offers seminars internationally on meditation, dream yoga, and death. His work has appeared in the Shambhala Sun, Buddha Dharma, Light of Consciousness, Utna Reader, and other periodicals. He is also the co-founder of Global Dental Relief and travels each year to India and Nepal to provide free care to impoverished children. So sit back, relax, and have a nice black cow. Our guest today is Andrew Holecek. Andrew, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Ted.
So we're going to be talking about your new book, Meditation in the iGeneration, How to Meditate in a World of Speed and Stress. But before we go into that, I wanted to ask for you to tell your story about how you first encountered Buddhism and contemplative practice.
Yeah. Well, I'm also very interested in how other people come across this path as well. My particular story really began as an undergraduate. I was doing a rather intensive double degree course in classical music. I'm actually a classical trained pianist, and biology with aspirations of going to either medical or dental school. And during the course of my second year, I started to develop dizzying spells, fainting spells, spontaneous kind of bloody noses and that sort of thing. And I started to get a little bit concerned. So I went to the Health Sciences Center, the Student Health Sciences Center at my campus, and I was diagnosed with, kind of a stress-induced hypertension. So in other words, my drive to be a good student had brought about high blood pressure. And it was actually somewhat dangerously high for a youngster. I was 20 years old at the time. So the physician that I was talking to, gave me some prescriptions, gave me some suggestions, the usual sort of thing. And I really wasn't too excited about living on antihypertensives and that sort of thing. And I remember reading a couple of years prior to this, some of the very preliminary studies way back, and this is in the late 70s here, Ted. I remember reading some books, literature about some of the physiological benefits of transcendental meditation. So, this might be of some benefit to me because the ability to control hypertension was one of the benefits. So I went to the lecture that was offered on campus fortuitously and signed up for my first experience in transcendental meditation. And it was a big deal for me. It was really a shapeshifter. It was the first time in my life that I had experienced, and this happened in my very first meditation instruction session, which was, doubly powerful. It was the first time in my life that I'd experienced the quality of mind, a state of mind completely devoid of thought, without being asleep. And it was a real shapeshifter. It was really a kind of a tectonic experience for me. And really, from that moment on, I realized there's more to reality than meets the eye. There's more to the mind than this conventional thought-laden mind. So I began my so-called career in meditation, principally through this Hindu-based approach. And then over the next number of years, as you may or may not know, way back then, there really wasn't much of a path quality to TM. It's changed these days. There's this much more path oriented, at least as I've come to understand it. So I started a somewhat systematic study of contemplative religious and spiritual traditions, really as a way to answer the question that I was posing to myself, is like, well, what's next? What can I do that will further stabilize and enhance this particular quality of mind? And then I remember very, very clearly reading Houston Smith's, classic text. At that point, it was The Religions of Man. That was politically more correct. I think the world's religions. And as I came to Houston's description of Buddhism, it immediately was really my first full-blown introduction, even though it was in a kind of an anthological form, of the principal teachings of this incredible tradition. And right from the very first page of his writing, when he talked about the Buddha literally being the awakened one, it immediately caught my attention. And I started a somewhat rigorous study, simply through the literature, which at that point wasn't that much. There wasn't that much out there quite yet. And then, to make a long story maybe a little bit more workable and short, I found myself landing. I was in the Midwest when I was going through this experience studying at Indiana University. And I eventually found my way to Boulder, Colorado, actually to study physics. And as you may know, that's the landing ground of a lot of spiritual traditions, and in particular, Rinpoche had established Naropa University. And I started to develop a relationship to that community. And, ever since then, which is, a couple of decades now, 3 decades plus, I have just found myself resonating with these teachings. It's really my kind of doctrinal and experiential home, and it remains so. Something like that, more or less.
Yeah, that's a wonderful background that I'm sure a lot of the listeners will understand, that they ran into something in their own lives, found this practice through various means, did little checking, and really inclined towards what they've seen and what was available to them in the tradition. That's a shared background for a lot of us. So
I think so, isn't it? And for me, really, it was also something that I came to experience a lot more later, that how it is that so many people really turn towards spirituality or contemplative meditative traditions when the conventional approach isn't working, or when some level of chaos, calamity, death, disease, and permanence rears its head. And in my circumstance, and I think this warrants a little iteration or reiteration, is, I really wasn't interested in spirituality per se at that point. I really wasn't interested in enlightenment. I just wanted to feel better. And sure enough, after I started my meditation, I'm sure some of the other kind of traditional recommendations were of also benefit, but within a couple of months, my blood pressure had returned to normal. I was sleeping again. The dizzying spells disappeared. And it was this kind of combination of physiological benefit and then obviously great spiritual and psychological insight. It was kind of that double-barreled approach that really propelled me into this path full bore.
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of people who come to this practice don't come to it because they're seeking a spiritual life or a religious tradition. They come to it through an experience of suffering and find some relief, even if it is just a lessening and attenuation of their suffering, instead of a full-blown permanent destruction of the fetters and that sort of enlightenment path that's still very pragmatically beneficial to them in their lives.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, how is it referred to sometimes, Buddhism, as a kind of a transcendental pragmatism? that still bears fruit in my life, both from a physiological, physical, and then, psycho-spiritual perspective as well. So absolutely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the book itself. What prompted you to write this new one?
Yeah, this is my third book, and the first two, especially the second one, was pretty, kind of hardcore Buddhist, especially Tibetan Buddhist. The first one was a little bit, I would say, softer or wider in that regard. And I always wanted to write a book that I could give to my mailman, to, something that was completely free of any of the cultural trappings, the colorings, the flavorings that are associated with Buddhism, and in particular, the tradition that I resonate with the most, which is Tibetan Buddhism, which is probably the most colorful, exotic, esoteric, and sometimes even wildly esoteric tradition of Buddhism altogether. I wanted to really present meditation in a way that was stripped free of all that, and to really bring forth to people the extraordinary power, as you know, of the contemplative traditions altogether, and in particular, this basic foundational exploration of mind and heart that we know and love as meditation. And this book itself, Ted, is the first of a two-volume set that I'm writing. Originally, I thought I could put all this in one book, but I wanted to make it a little bit more digestible, kind of bite-sized chunks. So the first book is a kind of a nuts and bolts introduction to meditation, which we can talk about in some detail if you like. And the second one that I'm working on is really on the benefits of meditation, the cognitive, emotional, physical, spiritual, and then social benefits. And as there are some 500 studies a year coming out now, which is extraordinary because in 1980 there were zero. But science has gotten its mitts on meditation, and because we often defer these days to science is really almost the religion of our age. This is where we go for truth. That once science starts to substantiate the power of this tradition, it has really taken off in the West, and it's a fantastic revolution and awareness and intention that I'm terribly excited about. I think there's also a handful of near enemies here that we might be able to discuss. The whole issue of mindfulness, and if it goes too fast, it can definitely be distorted. But I simply wanted to write something that I could give to my nephews, to my brother who's a wonderful Christian practitioner, to someone who really isn't interested in religion or Buddhism at all, but just wants to know, what is this thing called meditation? Why should I do it? Why should I take time out of my incredibly busy life to do it? What's in it for me? And that was really the fundamental aspiration, is to create a wide catchment, a wide kind of landing ground for people that really just wanted to know what this material is all about, free from religious or cultural trappings.
It's interesting, Andrew, that you've taken that as a key goal that you have, because that's very much what we're trying to do here with this podcast and the SBA and some of the other efforts that we're in, is sharing this with people who otherwise wouldn't find it. If you're already in a Buddhist tradition or you're interested in that sort of thing, you're already there. You're good. It's how do we make something that resonates with people, whether they are an atheist, a Baptist, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Jew, whatever their ideological background is. This practice at its core, I think, and I suspect you do as well, really is about our common human experience.
Exactly, very much so, Ted. And I think, in Sanskrit the word is upaya, which basically means skillful means. And skillful means, as you know, is really applied compassion. And as I've come to understand it, it's really meeting people where they are and not where we are. And that's how you can really start to communicate effectively with people, is speaking their language, speaking their vocabulary. And as you know all too well, this has been a monumental challenge for Buddhism from its, first inauguration into the Western world altogether. How can we bring the essence of this wisdom tradition into a brand new cultural container and really translate it not only liturgically, but even more importantly, culturally? And how can we take, in very practical terms, something that's been around for 2,600 years and really transplant it into our hearts and into our minds in the West? And as you know, with secular Buddhism, that is really the invitation and the challenge that we now all share. And I think this is really the way to touch people, to reach them, to communicate this. And just to reiterate, that's what I wanted to do with this particular book.
Well, let's talk for a few minutes about what you had mentioned a few minutes ago about what's in this book on specifics that you have around meditation and the instructions you give in that. Tell us a little bit about that and how you share that in the book.
Yeah. Obviously, what I do at the very beginning is I try to simply set forth, I guess philosophers sometimes use the word problematic, and that is, if meditation itself is being put forth as some kind of cure or at least aid, what is it a cure to? What is an aid for? That, of course, is intimated or hinted at in the very title itself. That, if we look at what's going on, it doesn't take too much insight to realize that this world is incredibly infected with speed and stress and mindlessness and distraction. In fact, I think this warrants some statement here that this is one of the signatures of what is referred to as the Dark Age. Common teaching in many traditions, the Hindus refer to it as Kali Yuga. Japanese Buddhists refer to it as Mappo. It's really, many traditions talk about this particular age being the Dark Age. And, there are overt and covert manifestations of that. The overt manifestations are pretty obvious. Ecological devastation, global warming, terrorism, just open your eyes and read the front page and you see it. But as you know, I think what's more provocative, in a certain sense more immediate for people like us, are the covert applications of the Dark Age. And really, to me, the signature of the Dark Age is distraction. And how it is that with all these incredible technological innovations, some of which we're using right now, that have their wisdom application, they're near enemies, they're shadow sides to this. And I refer to these instruments, these gadgets, the smartphones and everything that, the iPads and whatnot that we all know all too well. I sometimes refer to them as weapons of mass distraction. They're really potentially just as damaging as their military analogs. So, I wanted to start with that because that situates the problematic. And what I find so compelling here, and then I'll return very specifically to your question, is that it's kind of in the spirit of the Taoist tradition, this idea of co-emergence, that co-emergent with this age of darkness, this age of distraction, and it really is getting worse. As I really try to put forth in the beginning of the book, one of the biggest problems with distraction on a personal and then societal and global level is that distracted people don't notice things. And that level of distraction can lead to very common road accidents and all kinds of bumping psychologically or physically into things. But just as damaging is this global kind of aspect of distraction, which is, being unaware of what it is that we're doing to this planet, being unaware of how we're treating other sentient beings in the world altogether. So with that as the background, then what I do is I say, okay, well, this really is one of the most articulate, I think, areas of malaise and discord in the world today. What can we do about it? And then I try to put forth, well, concomitant with this rise of distraction is this revolution in the antidote, which is mindfulness meditation altogether. So I use a very basic mindfulness and then awareness technique that I was taught originally through my team experience and then through many years of basic mindfulness meditation, as you know, the fundamental template practice in all the Buddhist traditions. So I simply kind of unpack this technique using the three aspects of body, speech, and mind, and then try to provide very practical tips for how to do it, how to apply it, when to do it, where to do it, how to keep it going, the props that you need, really basic nuts and bolts material that I think anybody from any tradition can use as a way to make friends with their own mind, and then by extension, make friends with the rest of reality. And really, hopefully, as so many other writers and practitioners and meditation teachers are doing this day, try to turn the tide before, and I don't want to be too apocalyptic here, but before it gets too late. And I think, as you well know, that with all the studies coming out, I've been watching this Cosmos series. I don't know if you've been watching this.
Oh, yes. It's our friend Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, exactly. The last session was incredibly provocative and also disconcerting about, we're in extremely hot water. And because of our epidemic and insatiable appetite for distraction and entertainment, we continue to live in denial. So whatever we can do, each of us, to rouse ourselves and others from this very dangerous slumber, I think is warranted. So that's what I try to do with this book, and the basic mechanics behind it, I think, are pretty straightforward, which indeed I wanted them to be, so that anybody could really kind of sink their teeth into this practice and find out for themselves, does it work for you? Just like the Buddha himself always said. And the Dalai Lama himself often iterates that, if you find my teachings of benefit, take them to heart. If you don't, throw them out the window. And this is a wonderful kind of empirical, almost scientific approach to this particular path. It's one of the reasons I love it so much. And the invitation of this particular book is really just see if it speaks to you, if it does, take it to heart. I simply suspect, because I'm fundamentally no different than most other people in this world, just like everybody else, I want to be happy. Just like everybody else, I want to reduce my dissatisfaction. I think suffering is a bit of a heavy word, but basically my existential anxiety, my speed, my stress. I'm just like you. And that's why I feel that this particular book may resonate with others, because even though our storylines may be different, at the core of it, at the heart of it, we're really the same. We all pretty much want the same thing. So I figure sharing some of my story with things that have worked for me may be of benefit to those who really aren't that different from me.
And I think you're right. Our experiences are very much the same, and our stories about those experiences may differ. And of course, we have a wide range of experiences, but it's what we do that makes the difference. Andrew, one of the things I wanted to ask in this is as you had mentioned, your two previous books, and I'll link those for those of you who are listening, they'll be on the episode page. The Power and the Pain, Transforming Spiritual Hardship into Joy, and the other, Preparing to Die, Practical Advice and Spiritual Wisdom from the Tibetan Buddhist Tradition. They're very different than this one, and I'm wondering how you're balancing the need for sharing the practice with an audience who isn't necessarily going to become Buddhist, because that's a very different approach from what you have done previously with the new book.
If I understand your question properly enough, if I start to stray, please corral me back in. But the first book was, I would say, a mid-placed book between the second and the third book. The first book, on the Power and the Pain, was written really as a way for people who get involved in deep meditative practice, deep spiritual practice. And for me, it was inspired by my experiences in a 3-year meditation retreat, because in the classical Tibetan training, there's a 3-year meditation retreat, which is really like going to meditation college. And my experience in that retreat, which I finished about a decade or so ago, was incredibly transformative. But it was also extraordinarily challenging. It was really quite difficult. This level of deep, extensive meditation was a challenge. So I wanted to share a little bit of my experiences around that for those who engage in extensive practice, as a way to inspire them, to help them understand some of the more difficult shadow elements, the darker sides of meditation, so to speak, the dark night of the soul type of thing. And in a certain sense, really, chronologically, if I had to do it all over again, I probably would have written that book after this one. So be it. It came first. And, there's obviously so much I can share about that. And the second one is the most Buddhist of all the books. It's very much influenced by the Tibetan tradition of what's called thanatology, which is really the study of death and dying. In this particular book, again, even though it may seem esoteric at the outset, I fundamentally wanted to provide a new lens, a new view of old age, sickness, and death for the Western population, because as you know all too well, Ted, that really, I think Ernest Becker has said it so beautifully in his incredible book, The Denial of Death. We in the West live in the denial of death. We see it as a defeat. We see it as something to run away from and to hide. And from especially the Tibetan Buddhist point of view, if we can change our view of old age, sickness, and death, it actually provides, from a spiritual perspective, according to the Tibetans, the most opportune time in life, quite literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for very, very rapid psychological and spiritual growth. So the book is voluminous. It's a bit of an encyclopedia on death. I structure it in a format where what's the best thing to do before, during, and after death for yourself and for others, from both a spiritual and practical point of view. So I tried to make it as comprehensive as I possibly could, all the while keeping in mind that this is simply a way for people to prepare, to realize that if they relate to these challenging end of life circumstances properly, that instead of running from them, they can actually, not in a suicidal fashion, of course, but look forward to them, to realize what it is that nature might be teaching us, what it is that these situations present to us. And therefore, the aspiration would be to change the darkness towards the end of a life into fundamental light. So with that said, I can go further into either of those, or we can take this any place you want to go.
Well, with that in mind, that perspective that you have of appreciation for the tradition, and also with your background as a scientist, and as you mentioned, watching Cosmos, and I expect finding a sense of wonder and awe in the universe that we have before us. With those two backgrounds, which I find to not be in the least bit conflictive, but in fact complementary to one another.
Very much so, very much so.
But other people don't. You see those as loggerheads. I'm wondering what you see as some of the biggest challenges and opportunities in contemporary Buddhism.
Yeah, what a marvelous question. Well, one is, at least from what I see, is maintaining the integrity of the tradition, the lineages as they're represented in the many different schools, maintaining the idea of lineage and tradition, while yet making these teachings that are 2,600 years old applicable and immediate for us here and now. And if we don't do that, if we as representatives and really guardians of the tradition don't do that properly, first of all, Buddhism, I don't think this is going to happen, but it risks going extinct. Adaptation, I think Darwin was really onto something here, of course, that if situations don't adapt to contemporary times, they do run the risk of becoming obsolete, irrelevant, or extinct. I think one of the challenges is maintaining the integrity of this vast corpus of wisdom as it's transplanted into the West, translating it properly, as I alluded to earlier, not only liturgically, but culturally, and then finding ways for these teachings to speak to us, to resonate with our own experience. Other challenges would be, as you were suggesting, is that there's a tremendous power when science directs its lens towards something, because as I intimated earlier, we really turn to scientists almost as the high priests of our age. This, of course, as you know, happened with the transformation from the agrarian cultures to what is known scholarly now as modernism, which is when the power of science really usurped the power of the church. But just like the church was going a little bit extreme, the church was becoming extremist before the onset of science, in a kind of reverse knee-jerk response, now science has kind of dominated. It's kind of an intellectual imperialism. These are the near enemies of science, where science just kind of colonizes every other tradition. And this, of course, is when science turns into the pathology of what's called scientism, which means that if you can't prove it, if you can't bring a mathematical or methodological way to test and prove it within the confines of materialistic science, it doesn't exist. So this is a real danger in taking these wisdom traditions that are just as rigorous empirically. They have just the same sort of methodologies for proof as the hardcore Western materialistic sciences do. It's just that the object domains are different. The validity claims are different. But the fundamental methodologies that bring about proof in the world of spirit or meditation or religion are really, if you look at it properly, are fundamentally not that different from what constitutes proof in the Western scientific tradition. So one of the great challenges I see is as Buddhism comes into the West, kind of riding on the coattails of mindfulness, because as I mentioned before, there's amazing numbers of studies, and as more studies come out, it's a kind of a positive feedback loop. As more studies come out, there's more funding, and meditation truly, this is no exaggeration, as you well know, the meditation is really exploding in the West, and it's fantastic. But there are near enemies to this explosion. And one is that if we simply associate Buddhism altogether with mindfulness, in other words, the word's conflation, if we conflate Buddhism to mindfulness, then we're really missing out. We're really reducing the vast wisdom tradition into just this one basic practice, which is simply the entry point into the vast wisdom of the Buddhist tradition. So I think this is something we really have to be careful of, is using the wisdom of science to help substantiate meditation, but not letting science squash Buddhism down simply into mindfulness practice altogether.
It's an interesting difficulty that we see, that when we look at science as a method that is effective and intended for one thing only, discerning the veracity of claims in the natural world. Is this true or not? And that's all it is. And people who do science are well aware of this and make no claims beyond that. I think where there's use of the term scientism in a pejorative way is when there are accusations of, well, yeah, you guys can prove all this stuff in the real world, but we're making claims that we can't prove at all, and that trumps your real world stuff.
Yes, exactly.
I disagree with that. I think that's kind of nuts. Now, on the other hand, one of the things we need to be cautious of, and I think this is where you and I are very much in alignment, is that sure, we can show the rates of falling objects in a vacuum and measure that and know that in the natural world, and we can also be wonderfully inspired by what we see, for example, on Cosmos and the wonderful work that's coming out of that, and new scientific discoveries that open tremendous avenues for exploration. There are a lot of different things that people can be personally inspired by, and independent of the truth, veracity of those experiences, they can nonetheless be transformative and beneficial in people's lives.
Exactly. This idea that we're kind of circumambulating here is that, whatever arises, there's a number of different phraseologies for it, but one is whatever arises has a near enemy and a near friend side, and the near enemies are the things that really, really interest me. In terms of meditative practice, of course, there are many, many near enemies, the near enemies of escapism. And my friend John Wellwood talks about his spiritual bypassing. There are all kinds of shadow elements. But at the same time, whatever arises also has this wisdom component. So there's tremendous power to science, as you were just referring to, if it's kept in its respective domain, if it doesn't colonize the other disciplines of the world. And then really, this is one reason I'm a fan of, I'm sure you're aware of this movement, Ted, the integral movement. Integral theory, I think, is a very compelling map of reality that allows virtually all world traditions from whatever arena, sociology, psychology, anthropology, cultural studies, meditation, cognitive science, neuroscience. It basically gives each one of them its honored spot without allowing that particular spot to dominate the others. And this is what I find very, very compelling, very helpful in this age, is that if we can recognize the place of these traditions and their truths, use them to augment and support each other without taking each other down, then that's really a beautiful and elegant way to use not only science, but any discipline to support things like meditation and contemplative practice altogether.
Terrific point, Andrew. For folks who are listening, you can find out more about Andrew's work on his website, andrewholecek.com, and I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode. Our guest today, Andrew Holecek. Andrew, thanks for being here.
It's really been great fun, Ted. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monte Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.